Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, A History of Slavery in New England, by Jared Ross Hardesty. Narrated by Sanya Simmons. A note on the text, dates, and terminology. This book quotes original documents from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. In those periods, there was no uniform writing style. Writing was phonetic, meaning authors spelled words the way they sounded. Likewise, punctuation and capitalization were not standardized. To adhere as closely to the documents as possible, the text retains the misspellings, unsystematic capitalization, and erratic punctuation throughout. Superscript abbreviations, however, have been modernized and spelled out in full. Dates have likewise been modernized. Before September 1752, the British Empire remained on the Julian calendar and celebrated the New Year on 25 March. For that reason, the calendar used by the British was 12 days behind the Gregorian calendar used by the rest of Europe. Likewise, dates between 1 January and 24 March were often recorded with both the previous and New Year dates. For example, 15 January 1723 would be recorded as 15 January 1722/23. To avoid any confusion, this text uses 1 January as the new year, but does not change the day to conform to the Gregorian calendar. For example, 15 January 1722/23 appears as 15 January 1723. Finally, terminology can be complicated in a book about slavery. This text interchangeably uses the terms slave, bondsmen and women, and enslaved. The latter, however, is deployed most frequently, especially when emphasizing the agency enslaved men and women attempted to exercise over their own lives. Moreover, given that white colonists in New England enslaved people of indigenous American and African descent, the text utilizes catch-all terms, such as enslaved people, to be as comprehensive as possible, while attempting to be clear about who was enslaved and their racial categorization whenever possible. Likewise, the book uses the term Indian because that is the preferred nomenclature of indigenous people still living in the region today. It also deploys the contemporaneous term people of color to describe all enslaved and freed people. Nevertheless, when examining the coming of the American Revolution and emancipation, since most activists for abolition and civil rights were of African descent, the terms free black, freed black, and enslaved African appear. Preface. 15 George Street, Medford, Massachusetts, 02155. Standing in the middle of a modern residential neighborhood in suburban Boston, Massachusetts, is an 18th-century Georgian mansion. These are not an uncommon sight in New England, a region that embraces its history with placards, tourist attractions, and historic homes. Yet the house at 15 George Street in Medford stands out, even by New England standards. Well, not the house specifically, but rather the building that stands in front, between the house and George Street. It is unique. Too many windows and not quite large enough to be a barn. Its central chimney suggests a different purpose, a dwelling place for people. But why would a mansion, already 3 stories tall with many bedrooms, require additional living space? This address was the home of the Royal family. Isaac Royal Sr. purchased the property, which included a 2-story dwelling house and 500 acres of surrounding land in 1732. Over the next 5 years, he remodeled and added on to the house extensively, transforming it into the mansion that still stands there today. He also had the unusual outbuilding constructed. Upon Isaac Sr.'s death in 1739, the property passed to his son, Isaac Royal, Jr. The mansion house gives away much about the man who had it built. Adorned with a golden pineapple door knocker and surrounded by a wall likewise adorned with pineapples, this home paid homage to the tropics. Although Isaac Sr. was born in Massachusetts, he had spent much of his life in the British West Indian colony of Antigua. There, Royal dealt in sugar, rum, and slaves. Eventually, after a devastating hurricane, pestilence, and a slave conspiracy struck the island, Royal decided to take his family and fortune back to New England. Royal did not leave all his property behind in Antigua, however. Dwelling in that unusual outbuilding at 15 George Street were many of the 22 enslaved men and women Royal brought with him from the Caribbean. That building was a slave quarters. These men and women, most of them born in Africa, were trafficked by Royal to make his new country estate a success. Ripped from their homes for a second time, the people living in that outbuilding worked Royal's farm, kept his house, and took care of his family. And they created a life of their own, demonstrated by the many artifacts they left behind. The slave quarters standing at 15 George Street is the only freestanding slave quarters north of the Mason-Dixon line still existing in the United States. Certainly there are many slave quarters in the South and Caribbean, but suburban Boston? This building suggests a different history of New England, one that is not only littered with Puritans and patriots, but also enslaved Africans and Indians. The slave quarters at 15 George Street opens a whole world of slavery in New England. It was deeply connected, culturally, socially, and economically, to slavery in the Caribbean. Enslaved men and women in New England clung to their cultures while crafting their own identities in the region. Dramatically outnumbered by the white population, they resisted slavery not through outright rebellion, but through small challenges to the status quo. And they demanded their labors and their struggles be recognized by the community. No resident of 15 George Street demonstrates this better than Belinda Sutton, a woman who lived under Isaac Sr. and Isaac Jr.'s tyranny. Years after being kidnapped and trafficked away from Africa, Sutton found her freedom. Her enslaver, Isaac Jr., was a loyalist and fled during the American Revolution. Although Royal freed Sutton in his will, she had already struck out on her own when the Revolutionary Commonwealth of Massachusetts seized the royal estate. And yet, Sutton struggled under freedom. She moved to Boston and worked menial jobs to support herself and her disabled daughter, Prine. In 1783, she acted. With the help of free black activist Prince Hall, she filed a petition with the state government demanding payment from the seized royal estate. Sutton reasoned that her labor had been stolen by the royals for 5 decades, and that she was entitled to one morsel of the family's immense wealth, which had been partially accumulated by her own industry. The legislature agreed, granted Sutton's request, and awarded her an annual pension of £15, 12 shillings, to be paid out of Royal's estate. She would later file 4 more petitions asking for further compensation. In short, Sutton demanded and received reparations for her years of bondage. Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds tells the story of people like Belinda Sutton. Scholars have given much attention to the subject of New England slavery in recent years, and there have been several public reckonings about the centrality of slavery to early New England life. Nevertheless, the most recent overview of slavery in the region is Lorenzo Johnston Green's The Negro in Colonial New England, published in 1942. Given the recent surge in interest in New England slavery by academics and the public alike, this book is an updated review of the subject. It is meant as a short, listenable introduction to New England slavery and is informed by the latest scholarship. The text is organized around one central theme: connections. New England slavery was actually part of a wider world of slavery and colonization in the Americas, and was important for the emergence of American industrial capitalism. At the same time, however, the book pays close attention to the lives of those enslaved in New England and how their experiences related to larger historical processes. Although slaves comprised only about 4% of New England's population on the eve of the American Revolution, this number does not reveal the importance of slavery to the region. Indeed, when looking at New England's urban areas, such as Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, the percentage of slaves grows dramatically to 12 and 25%, respectively. Likewise, in those towns, slave labor was vital to a number of industries, such as distilling and shipbuilding, and if historians do not account for slaves, the relative economic success and growth of these places in the long 18th century, 1689 to 1815, cannot be explained. While not as important across all of rural New England, slaves still provided considerable labor, especially in western Rhode Island's Narragansett country and the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Demographics aside, slavery built New England's economy and shaped cultural traditions. In the 17th century, the region's colonists seized land from indigenous inhabitants to supply burgeoning sugar plantations in the Caribbean with food, livestock, and timber necessary to function. As economic ties grew, so did social ones. Some of Harvard's earliest graduates hailed from Barbados, while New England patriarchs such as John Winthrop sent second sons to start plantations in the Caribbean. Such deep connections helped to foster and develop slavery as an institution in New England, including slave law and labor structures, and shaped the lives of enslaved people, many of whom were Indian captives sold to the West Indies in exchange for African slaves, or Africans who spent significant time in the Caribbean before arriving in New England. Even after the American Revolution severed ties to the British Caribbean, and locals abolished slavery within New England, the region's merchants and manufacturers found new markets in other slave societies, such as Spanish Cuba, French Saint-Domingue, Brazil, and, in a patriotic fury, the American South. Understanding slavery in New England, then, requires recognition of these connections. Certainly, some developments in New England slavery were indigenous to the region, such as the creative yet coercive and cruel mechanisms the Puritans used to steal land from and enslave local Indians, or the emphasis on Christianizing slaves. Nevertheless, New Englanders envisioned themselves as part of a larger world of slavery. It seemed everywhere Englishmen traveled in the early modern period, they encountered slavery, whether among indigenous groups in North America, the Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, or the empires and states of Africa. Many came to associate slavery with success when establishing colonies, and freely appropriated from the examples available to them. New England was no exception, borrowing heavily from other places. Most importantly, these connections shaped the everyday lives and lived experiences of New England's enslaved population. In short, and as the book title suggests, the worlds created by white colonists on stolen native land influenced the lives of enslaved people. Enslaved Africans arrived in New England via the same trade networks that exchanged Indian captives, agricultural products, and manufactured goods for molasses, sugar, coffee, and cacao. Many slaves could remember their former lives in the Caribbean and Africa, bringing those cultural traditions with them. The Atlantic economy that fueled the exchange of slaves also created the coercive conditions under which slaves labored, whether in a Boston shipyard, a Connecticut tobacco farm, or a Newport distillery. Furthermore, it skewed gender ratios, as New Englanders preferred male slaves. Nevertheless, slaves also participated in this economy not only as coerced producers, but as consumers of goods and ideas. Indeed, the peculiarities of the region, such as emphasis on slave literacy, often combined with larger Atlantic trends to create real opportunities for slaves to assert their agency, defend themselves, their communities, and their families, and forge creative paths to independence. Structures and systems of oppression crafted by whites, however, often stymied and limited slave action. Ultimately, then, the history of slavery in New England was a dialogue defined by assertions of autonomy and humanity tempered by white supremacy and influenced by larger historical forces, namely the Atlantic economy. To make sense of these themes, this book is organized both chronologically and thematically. Given that the history of slavery in New England was a relatively short-lived phenomenon, only lasting from the 1630s to the early 19th century, most of the chapters are organized thematically, but still deal with change over time. They examine the origins of slaves and slavery in New England, followed by an exploration of the people trafficked into slavery in the region. The book then illuminates the society that shaped New England slavery, relationships between enslaved and enslaver, and slave law in the region. Delving into the working lives of enslaved people, it examines the many types of labor they performed. The private lives of enslaved people, including their families, communities, and patterns of resisting slavery, then come into focus. Finally, there is a chronological narration of the relationship between the American Revolution and slavery in New England, including abolition. The book concludes by exploring the new struggles created by freedom and the legacies of slavery in New England. Chapter 1. Origins. In August 1645, leading Salem, Massachusetts resident and attorney Emanuel Downing wrote to his brother-in-law and former Massachusetts governor John Winthrop about a war with the Narragansett Indians of modern Rhode Island. Concerned about the spiritual well-being of the young colony, Downing believed the conflict to be good and just. Waging war on those who maintained the worship of the devil, like the Narragansett, would allow God to deliver Indian captives into our hands. These prisoners, in turn, could be exchanged for African slaves, which would be more useful than we conceive. Downing was shockingly blunt and honest in his letter. He proposed capturing Indians, enslaving them, and trading them for African captives. Having been resident in the colony for a number of years, Downing surveyed the young settlements and realized that Massachusetts suffered from a severe labor shortage. The colony required a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business, because white settlers desired freedom to plant for themselves, or would demand very great wages to work for somebody else. Land was plentiful and workers scarce in early Massachusetts, and Downing understood this problem. To keep established farms and workshops in operation, Massachusetts needed laborers. And who better than African slaves? As the attorney conceded and Winthrop knew very well, the colony could maintain 20 slaves cheaper than one English servant. Downing's letter is important to understanding the origins and nature of slavery in colonial New England. Colonial expansion depended on two interrelated factors: displacement of the indigenous population and labor. Using connections to a larger Atlantic world, white New Englanders could address both problems with one solution, in this case, an Indian war. By capturing Indians in just wars against non-Christians, colonists could obtain a valuable trade commodity to exchange for African slaves. These Africans would be acquired through the region's extensive trade with the Caribbean, the center of New World slavery. Even better for colonists, as Downing was sure to remind Winthrop, Africans were allegedly hardy and required little for survival. making them a much cheaper labor source than white settlers. Articulating the racial theories of his time, Downing used his beliefs about African inferiority to make a fiscally sound argument. New England had cultivated connections with the source for slaves, while wars both displaced Indians, opening more land for settlement, and transformed humans into a good to be bought and sold. In short, as Downing's letter demonstrates, slavery was on the table from the earliest years of settlement. The New England colonies, home to around 1,700 slaves in the late 17th century, was not that different from other English settlements in North America. The region contained a small number of African slaves who supplemented the largely white workforce and settler population. Enslaved men and women arrived from all over the Atlantic world, attempted to build lives to the best of their ability, and found themselves exploited at the hands of a vicious, humiliating, and dehumanizing colonial regime. Slaves and Englishmen. For the Englishmen and women who settled New England, slavery was something both foreign and familiar. While they would not have encountered many enslaved Africans in England before sojourning across the Atlantic, they would have been aware of various forms of captivity and bondage from around the globe. As such, the first generations of New Englanders had a relatively ambivalent relationship with slavery. On the one hand, slavery was always on the table and a tool of colonization. There was, however, a deep-seated fear about the presence of so many enslaved strangers present in their colonial experiment in the North American wilderness. Such attitudes created a legal, albeit ill-defined, form of slavery. By the 1500s, slavery had largely disappeared in England itself. The ancient Celts and subsequent invaders alike, including the Romans, Anglo-Saxons, and Vikings, practiced slavery. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, however, slavery in England withered away over the High and Late Middle Ages. Perhaps foreshadowing colonists' own predicament in the New World, centuries of plague and famine created labor shortages, especially following the Black Death, 1348-49, which killed roughly one-third of England's population. Both artisans and agricultural workers took advantage of the dearth of workers to demand higher wages, rights, and workplace privileges. In the process, many English peasants acquired their own property, becoming free landowning farmers called yeomen. Likewise, craftsmen laid claim to the right to control and bargain with their own labor and skill sets, a legal concept known as property in labor. Both yeomen and artisans were protective of their rights, independence, and property, promoting a culture and ideology of free labor. Nevertheless, despite a culture emphasizing the rights of free workers, multiple forms of bound labor existed in England. Although most agricultural workers were free, serfdom still existed in parts of the kingdom. Likewise, young men and women would enter into various states of dependence to learn how to farm, keep house, or a skilled trade. Called servants in husbandry for boys and girls in rural areas, and apprentices for young tradesmen learning a craft, this form of bondage was common and part of a young person's transition to adulthood. Being bound out to a neighbor or local master artisan offered England's youth the opportunity to learn how to be productive and independent laborers. While this description implies benevolence and a happy dependence between master and servant, coercion and violence were integral parts of this relationship. A key part concerned disciplining young people to move them toward becoming good, contributing community members. Indeed, by the early 1500s, the nature of servitude began to change. Landowners, both noble and common, began experimenting with their land, turning it over to the production of cash crops, livestock, and marketable foodstuffs. This transition displaced large numbers of free peasants who became vagrants looking for work. To address this social and economic crisis during Queen Elizabeth I's reign, English officials, both local and national, promoted a number of relief programs. Many of these programs indented, transformed into servants, poor people, especially the young, to wealthier landowners and tradesmen. The idea behind these programs was not teaching useful skills, but rather using legally dependent relationships to maintain order and the status quo. And much like traditional servitude, violence structured these relations. Likewise, to regulate both forms of servitude, English jurists created laws that governed masters and servants. The Bible, especially important to the radical Protestants who settled New England, also provided an important perspective on slavery. Depending on how one read the Bible, it could provide a powerful critique of slavery, such as the Book of Exodus, or condone bondage, such as the various laws governing slavery in Leviticus. Even the New Testament implicitly approved of slavery, instructing all who are under the yoke of slavery to regard their masters as worthy of all honor. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. Especially important to how early modern English readers considered the Bible's message on slavery was how they regarded themselves. For them, they would have been allowed to enslave non-Christians and foreigners, or in their parlance, strangers. In that sense, the message of liberation contained in Exodus was meant only for God's chosen people. Ambivalent language aside, many Europeans did look to the Bible for guidance on slavery. When they first encountered sub-Saharan Africans, many used the Bible to better understand the black people they were encountering. They found solace in the story of Noah and his son Ham, who, according to Scripture, had looked on his father's naked body after a night of drunken revelry. Upon learning of his son's transgression, the patriarch punished his son, permanently marking him and forcing him and his progeny to serve his brothers. Known as the Curse of Ham, Europeans associated African blackness with this biblical story, which provided an important precedent for enslaving Africans. More concretely, an early account of slave ownership from New England demonstrates how the Bible could be used to justify and govern slavery. Theophilus Eaton, one of the founders of the New Haven colony, later part of Connecticut, and its first governor, owned at least 3 slaves, Anthony, John Juan, and Juan's wife, Lucretia. After Eaton's death in 1658, his daughter, Hannah Jones, became involved in a dispute over the status of Juan and Lucretia. Were they indentured servants whose service ended after a period of time, or were they bound for life? According to Jones's testimony, the slaves were servants forever or during his pleasure, according to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 45 and 46. By drawing on biblical law to understand the legal status of John and Lucretia Juan, Jones's action demonstrates how early modern Englishmen and women used Scripture to navigate slavery. As the various forms of servitude and the Bible suggest, most early modern Englishmen and women would have been acquainted with slavery. As England underwent its own economic and social transformations during the 16th century, large numbers of English people also began to travel the globe. Everywhere they turned, whether in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, they encountered slavery. Travelers and explorers published their findings and encounters with the world. These books and pamphlets found wide readership, as the English Reformation and its emphasis on reading the Bible had created a literate public. As readers navigated the world in print, they prided themselves on being a nation of free men. They were exceptional, free people in a world of slavery. As England embraced liberty at home, it could not escape the world of slavery. While travel narratives described the barbarities of bondage, they also demonstrated how, especially for Spain's and Portugal's American colonies, slavery could be useful. Enslaved people, indigenous and African, provided the heavy labor required to extract the silver and sugar that enriched the Iberian Peninsula. At the same moment that English privateers were attacking Spanish shipping, and intellectuals were making arguments that New World...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?